if I remember correctly, last Thursday we had done about the first 5 lines.
Yes.
So we're 785 lines behind.
Beautiful.
Which is about half of what we'll be behind after today. So pick up with line 4. And we're told, shield having seized the mead benches from many tribes, troops of enemies, struck fear into earls. And the verb there, or what is said there about the mead benches, what's that mean? What's the poet saying? He seized the mead benches.
He overthrew the whole.
Yeah, pretty much that's it. It doesn't mean he came in, knocked on the door, and said, sorry, we're having a party. I need additional seating. Can I borrow your benches? Okay? He destroyed the hall, probably. Okay? So when he seized the mead benches, what did he do to the men who were sitting on the benches? Yeah, they were slaughtered. Okay? Notice, he seized the mead benches, struck fear into earls. Though he first was found a waif, he awaited solace for that. And the word there that is used for solace is frovra. It appears several times throughout the poem. Now, I think this idea of solace or consolation is ultimately central to the meaning of the poem. And that's related to possibly the audience of the poem. Or at the very least, maybe not the audience of the poem when the poem was first composed, if you accept an early date for the poem, but possibly an audience for the date of the poem when the poem was transcribed into the manuscript in which we have. Okay? And I should add this. I should back up for a moment and I mentioned Kevin Kiernan the other day. And I mentioned a couple of scholars' names. Kevin Kiernan, Andy Orchard. Let me throw a couple others out real quickly. J.R.R. Tolkien, and briefly mention them before we go on. I mentioned Kiernan and his analysis of the Beowulf manuscript, and he argues that the poem that we have is synonymous with the manuscript copy that we have. Okay? That is, the poem we have today never existed prior to it being copied in the manuscript that we have. Okay? Probably what existed was a poem about Beowulf and his early doings, Grindel's mother. Beowulf, his fight against the dragon, was a separate poem, and whoever put it together here made the poem that we now have. Okay? Very few scholars accept that idea. Very few. Okay? I think he makes a pretty good argument. But nobody doubts, almost nobody doubts Kiernan's knowledge of the manuscript. That is, pretty much everybody goes, but he knows this manuscript inside and out. He knows it better than anybody else. Okay? Because he's been studying the actual manuscript for, nearly 40 years. Okay? He's one of the few people in the world who can go to the British Library and get the manuscript. I mean, fill out the shelf mark number and they will deliver the manuscript to him in the rare book reading room, etc. Because almost nobody else has that. Right. And it's because of the work he's done with it. I mean, it's huge National Science Foundation grants to photograph this thing, etc. Like I said, I'm going to put some links up so you can look at, some stuff. And I'll put some links to the British Library website for the Beowulf manuscript, which uses images that Kevin Kiernan and his team produced, etc. Okay? Andy Orchard, I mentioned, probably one of, if not the best critic on Beowulf. That is, reader of the poem, aware of all of the analogies and allusions and all that kind of stuff. His book, A Critical Companion to Beowulf, if you decide to write about Beowulf for your paper, there's two things you have to look at. That, because that'll give you an idea of where to go look for other sources. And then this. Tolkien's essay, Beowulf, the Monsters, and the Critics. Right? Tolkien delivered this essay in 1936. Radically changed the quote-unquote arc of Beowulf scholarship. Why? Prior to Tolkien arguing this, before The Hobbit, before Lord of the Rings, this is before all the fantasy stuff, he was working on all the fantasy stuff in the background, had been for 20 years. Okay? Tolkien was the first one to say that Beowulf, the poem that we have, Beowulf, is a literary work of art. Everybody else prior to Tolkien, even literary scholars who read Beowulf, looked at Beowulf primarily like a dwarf, Tolkien's universe, looks at a mine. You dig it. To do what? Get stuff out of it. What's the stuff you dig into Beowulf to get out of it? Information it tells us about ancient German culture. For example, what does it tell us about gift-giving protocols or customs? That's one of the things you read Beowulf for. What does it tell us about the ancient Germanic tribes? That's one of the things you read Beowulf for. What does it tell us about, we can kind of take that mentality and update it to the 1990s and stuff. What does it tell us about male-female relations? That's what Tolkien said no. That's looking at something like Beowulf or any work of literature. And not understanding it as a work of literature. You don't read Beowulf, you don't read Shakespeare, you don't read Dickens, you don't read Dickinson, you don't read XYZ for information. You don't read it to kind of find out something that you can then use as a club to beat somebody else over the head with. Okay? Why do you read Beowulf? It's because of these. See, prior to Tolkien, nobody paid any attention to the monsters. They looked at Grendel, Grendel's mother, and the dragon, and they're like, if only the poet had really spent his attention on the important stuff. Germanic social customs. That's the important stuff. I mean, you have this image of this woman who keeps coming around, and she's offering drinks. That's an important custom. You have the naming of swords. That's an important custom. You have, the thanes fighting for their lord, and the lord giving the soldiers, treasure. That's an important custom. Why did he talk about the monsters? The monsters are silly. Why? Why are monsters silly?
Not real.
Because they don't exist. There aren't Grendels. Okay? Tolkien said, no. You are wrong. Okay? That's why the title is Beowulf, the Monsters, and the Critics. Because the critics were kind of typical English bone-headed, pin-headed, narrow-minded, not looking at kind of the big picture. So Tolkien focused on the monsters. He focused on Beowulf's rise and fall. His rise, overcoming Grendel's mother. His fall, the fight against the dragon. The monsters, Tolkien argued, are central to the poem. So if they are central to the poem, then they are central to the meaning of the poem. It has to do something with Beowulf fighting the monsters. Are the monsters there simply because they are monsters? Or do the monsters possibly represent something? And Tolkien took that tack. He's not, naive enough to say there really was a Grendel. You read some of Tolkien's manuscript stuff, and at times think he really believed there were elves. I mean, there really are fairies. I've read the fairy story essay in all of its drafts, going back to the very first draft. And I'm not kidding. Tolkien talks about fairies and elves like they really exist. Okay? Grendel doesn't exist. Dragons don't, at least now, exist. They didn't then either. Why are they there? Because they're symbolic. They point to something else. Okay? So it's up to us to determine, what do they point to? Why are the monsters so important? And I think one of the reasons is the monsters give us some of the problems for which this is needed. Solace, consolation, comfort. Old word that shows up a lot in the King James Bible, succor. It means to comfort, to aid, to give relief to alleviate, if you want. Okay? So, we're told about Scyld-Sheving that he was found a waif, that is, a foundling, is what the Old English really means. Okay? And he awaited solace for that. He grew under heaven, he prospered in honor, until every one of the encircling nations over the wheels riding had to obey him. Where are the encircling nations? I think I've put up on D2L already a map of the geography of Beowulf. Okay? You've got Denmark sticking up like this, northern Germany over here, Frisia, etc., etc. It's not a good map. Okay? You got Norway over here, Sweden over here, and right in between these two, there's a little island. Modern day, this is Denmark. Okay? This is Sweden. Copenhagen, if I remember right. Copenhagen's either here or here. I can't remember which. Okay? The Danes inhabit probably this island in this northern part of the peninsula. So when it says Scyld-Sheving made it so that all the encircling nations had to obey him, that means all these people. What does that mean they had to obey him? Taxes, that's a modern word. What's an old word? Tribute. They had to pay tribute. Or, what's another way of putting it? Not taxes, because that's government. But imagine New York. Mobsters. Protection racket. Kind of like government. Okay? It's a protection racket. Pay me or else. That was a good king, our poet then says. Fat was gold kinning. That's all it says. That phrase will be used 3 times in the poem. One of them, it begins with ak, but. Okay? So it's used directly twice. Fat was gold kinning. Here, about Scyld-Sheving. So if the poet says Scyld-Sheving was a good king, why was he a good king? What did he do? It's from the poet's perspective of the people that Scyld-Sheving was king of.
It said he shared his riches, doesn't it? Like,
Does it say he shared his riches in those opening 11 lines?
Is that later?
That comes later. Okay? So,
He was fearsome.
he is fearsome to whom? His own people?
His enemies.
His enemies. So what do you want for your king to be? Machiavelli wrote a whole little book about this, right? Called The Prince. Do you want your prince? If you're the prince, do you want to be feared or loved? Yeah, that'd be pretty interesting little, because if I said feared and loved, I bet some of you would go, loved, it's better to be loved, because then people like you and you can, and other people say, no, it's better to be feared. Why? Because then they know where you stand. Okay? So, he's feared by his neighbors. What else? What has he done seemingly to his kingdom?
United it.
Okay, he's united it. What else? Think of this little tiny island. And it now holds power where? He's expanded his kingdom. Right? So maybe a couple of hallmarks of a good king are make it so that your enemies are afraid to get involved with you. By the way, link there to Hamlet, Polonius's advice to his son Laertes. Don't get into a quarrel, but if you do, make it so that the other guy doesn't want to quarrel with you again. Which can be read, kill the bastard. I mean, it could be interpreted that way. It could also mean injure him so badly he can't do anything later. Okay? What else? He's expanded his kingdom. He's brought comfort to his people. That was a good king. A boy was later born to him. Young in the courts, notice whom God had sent. That's what, line 12 or so? Yeah. Thamavara was after Kenneth, young in Yardum, young in the yards, who God, the Old English reads Goda, God sent. God sent this young boy to Shildsheving for what? There it is again. As a frovra to his people, as a comfort, a consolation to his people. Now the he isn't capitalized. So does it refer to the boy or does it refer to God? Or as I had somebody send me a question about my previous class, asking, two different questions, is this or is this going to be on the exam? And I said, yes. Day before the exam, I'm not going to answer that kind of question. The he here, it's ambiguous. Okay? It could be God saw their need, the dire distress they had endured, lordless, for such a long time, and therefore he sent the comforter, biblical language there. Or it could be the boy saw their need. But then we get the Lord of life, wielder of glory, gave him worldly honor. I kind of think it's God saw the need, so God filled the gap. And who was this person? Look at the footnote. Not the monster-slaying hero of the title, but an early Danish king. Many scholars agree that the original name was Beowulf, but the manuscript reads Beowulf. Beowulf. Okay? In other words, most modern scholars / editors think whoever copied this screwed up. They add the ulf. Why? Because Beowulf later in the poem. And the copy is equating the two. The son of Scyld was renowned. His fame spread wide in Scandinavian lands. And then we get our first real gnomic passage of the poem. And there's a bunch of them. Right? What's this mean again? Gnomic? Not said by a little gnome, garden gnome kind of thing.
Like a proverb.
A proverb, a wise saying. Thus should a young man bring about good with pious gifts from his father's possessions. Now, put that in modern English. How do you bring about good with, leave the pious part out, with your dad's belongings? Well, so that later in life, loyal comrades will stand beside him when war comes. What do we know about king or leader Thane relationship?
The Thanes go fight your wars for you.
Thane go fight your wars, and the reciprocal side of that,
You give them the treasure.
you distribute treasure. That's what the young man does with his father's possessions. Thus should a young man bring about good with pious gifts from his father's possessions. What will the good be? Later in life, comrades will stand beside him when war comes. Now that is lines 20 through 24. I think, and there aren't many that think this, I think these 4 lines are referring to something that happens in the latter half of the poem. In fact, it's about the latter third of the poem. Beowulf goes to fight the dragon. who goes with them. Well, he handpicks men to go with them. But then he says, you guys stay here. Why? It's a monster. I'm a monster slayer. You are not. You stay here. You watch. And he's getting his you-know-what kicked. And one of his things goes off and helps. And when none of the others do, that thing then goes back at the end of the dragon scene and says, Beowulf wasted his treasure when he gave it to you. Why? You didn't come to him in his time of need. What does the poet just said here? Thus should a young man bring about good, so that later in life, his comrades will stand beside him when war comes, the people will support him. With praiseworthy deeds, a man will prosper among any people. See, I think it might not be an accident that the scribe puts Beowulf here. I think the scribe might be making the exact same kind of connection I just made. That he's thinking, because he's read, he knows what happens. You know, Beowulf distributes the treasure he received as king, and they don't stand with him. Why would the poet suggest that? Well, it could be maybe the poet is raising a question about heroic society. Or, at the very least, heroic practice. Now, that idea is almost anathema in Anglo-Saxon studies. When I raised this kind of question back in the 1990s on ANZACS, the International Anglo-Saxon Discussion List, I needed to kind of barricade myself because I had people coming out of the woodwork. How dare you even suggest, that the poet's raising... Well, now a lot of people think that. Okay? So, anyways, we go on. Scyld died. Why? Because everybody dies. Notice, he's not a god. Scyld died, passed away at his appointed hour. The mighty lord went into the Lord's keeping. Notice, lowercase lord, capital Lord. I don't remember how the Old English distinguishes between those. 27. Failure, yeah, mighty lord, went into the Freon's keeping. The Lord, though this word isn't usually translated as Lord. It's closer to, it's related to, if I remember correctly, that. The Old Norse Freya, like the god, okay, and also friend. Go on. So, he went into the Lord's keeping. Biblical parallel? They bore him down to the brimming sea, his dear comrades, as he himself had commanded, while the friend of the Scyldings wielded speech. So when did he command this? And what are they talking about? They took him down to the brimming sea. Why? What are they going to do? He's dead.
Viking
Little late for the baptism. Should have done that just before he died,
Viking funeral ceremony.
Viking funeral ceremony, because what is, according to popular mythology, the Viking funeral ceremony?
Put him on a boat, send him off to sea.
Put him on a boat, send him off to sea, and usually in film,
Set him on fire.
get some, Olympic class archer 500 yards away, and he's getting a postage stamp. It doesn't happen. There's only a couple instances of any reference to something with fire in the boat. We do know there were boat burials. Why? A lot of them have been discovered. In the fjords of Norway, near Copenhagen. I'm going to talk about one in just a moment in England. Okay? So, notice, Scyld gave commands for when I died, this is what I want you to do. So, they put him in the ship, they lay him down. Those of you who are Tolkien fans, your Tolkien nerd alerts ought to be going off here, because Everybody says, "Oh, you're so creative." He is a rank plagiarist. I say that as a lover of Tolkien. Okay? I'm going to have people on YouTube go, you know, I'm going to be searching out my address and doxing me and everything. So, what does he do? They put him in the ship and they lay around him treasure. It's Boromir's funeral, if you're familiar with Lord of the Rings. Okay? In its bosom lay many treasures, which were to travel far with him into the keeping of the flood. Notice what the speaker doesn't say. They were to travel with him into the afterlife so he could enjoy them in Valhalla. Nope. They're just going with him into the ocean. And they're going to sink. With no fewer gifts did they furnish him there, the wealth of nations, and those who did at his beginning first sent him forth alone over the waves while still a small child. So we get repeated that shield shoving arrived how? On a boat as a child. Ring any bells? Sound like anybody else in quote Moses? Very similar. What did Moses become for his people? Louder? Liberator, deliverer, savior. What did Shield Sheving become for the people who found him? Liberator, deliverer, savior. Okay? It's a very clear parallel between the two. And then the poet says, they set a golden ensign over his head. They let the waves take him. Men do not know how to say truly, not trusted counselors, nor heroes under the heavens. Who received that cargo? In other words, we don't know where he went. Okay? Now, this passage became very, very important in, make sure I get the date right, it's either 1938 or 1939. I can never remember which day. My fingers to type right. In 1930, come on, give me the date of the discovery. 1939. In 1939, there's this woman named Elizabeth Pretty, I believe, who owned land in southeast England, East Anglia, and on that land, there are a bunch of barrows, like 30 barrows, okay? And she's not a dummy. She figured these are burial mounds. What she wondered was, anything left? So she hires a local archaeologist, and this guy starts digging in the biggest of the mounds. Okay? And he discovers the mound's been dug into before, because he goes down quite a bit. You could tell the soil had been disturbed, but he keeps going. And lo and behold, he discovers in this mound that, if I remember right, it's about 100 feet long, about 50 feet tall. So, not like little mound, big mound of dirt. He finds the remains of a boat. No wood is left, okay? But you have, because the soil is all sandy, you have the staining of wood and you have the rust left from the rivets. It's not just any old boat. It's not like a little, like this room, roughly 30-foot fishing boat. This is about a 90-foot long by, I want to say 15, 16 feet wide longboat, like a Viking longboat, okay? And there's treasure. Well, what kind of treasure? There's a bag of gold coins. There's part of a sword. There's the remains of a shield. There's the remains of a helmet. There's remains of a coat of mail. It's just a pile of rust at this point. There's a big, giant, 3-foot in diameter, solid silver bowl, which later turns out to be from Alexandria, Virginia. Yeah, that's good. Alexandria. It's either Alexandria or Constantinople. Alexandria, Egypt, or Constantinople. Okay, whole bunch of stuff. So they immediately have to have a coroner's inquest. Why? British law at the time is, if you find buried treasure, you have to determine why it was put in the ground. Because why it was put in the ground will determine who gets to keep it. Whether it's the person upon whose property it is found or the government's. And the law, if I remember correctly at the time, is if it's determined to be grave goods, burial goods, that is, it's put in the ground and intended to stay in the ground forever and ever, then it becomes the property of the person whose property it's found on. Totally. Okay? If, however, it's plunder, that is, it was buried to be taken back out of the ground, like, you know the Vikings are coming, so you bury your stuff, run away, come back, then it becomes the Crown's. Okay? So they had a coroner's inquest. They actually have to have a coroner, and the coroner has to present his findings. No body was discovered. Okay? There's still some debate as to whether or not there was a body. Early on, there was some chemical analysis that suggested there was some phosphorus, which could be, decomposed human remains. Not conclusive. One of the pieces of evidence introduced into the inquest was this passage from Beowulf. Why? Because it matches almost perfectly what was discovered, even down to the standard. Okay? So it was determined, grave goods, it's all yours, Mrs. Pretty. And she immediately gave it to the country. She said, "Nah, I can't keep this. This isn't just mine." And this is huge. This is a huge discovery. There's only been one more major, quote-unquote, Anglo-Saxon discovery in the 20th century, and that was about 15 years ago. You can look it up if you want. The Staffordshire Hoard. This was thought to be plunder. This was thought to be somebody buried this because they were getting ready to be attacked and they didn't want anybody else finding it. It's huge. Ton of gold in this one. Okay? So,
Dr. Stern,
yes.
what is the, I guess archaeological, or historical reasoning for there being such a concentrated number? Because you said there were 30.
Right.
So, why were there so many in one place?
Apparently it was like a cemetery. Okay? Go to Stonehenge. You'll see something similar. Look at the pretty rocks, turn your back. And don't look at the rocks, look out in the distance. And you will see almost all the way around mounds. Stonehenge obviously is older, however, than Sutton Hoo. Sutton Hoo, this burial mound, we think, not 100% positive, but we think it was for Radwald, who you read about in the section in Bede. Question in the back?
Oh, I was gonna ask, did they dig up the other mounds?
Oh yeah, they've been excavated since then.
Okay, so was there other stuff found?
Yes.
They found other boats and stuff?
No other boats, but they found bodies. They found horses buried with bodies, which indicates a chieftain and such. But we think that this main burial, the main one, was where Radwald was either buried or commemorated. That is, it was a cenotaph. That is, when you have a burial but you don't have a body left.
That would explain the lack of actual body.
Explain. Plus, the soil's very acidic. So you don't find when an Anglo-Saxon burial site or a Roman burial site today is discovered. It's pretty exciting news. If you're weird, it's pretty exciting news if bodies or skeletons are found because the soil's very acidic. There's one. Where did I read about it? Just sometime in the last year. Roman cemetery with I don't know, like 50 or 100 bodies found. Another one found a couple of years ago, whole bunch of people decapitated. And this is referenced, I think in Bede. I think that was a Norse army where the English had slaughtered the Norse, etc. Okay, but we think this is Radwald, the guy who, became a Christian, raised a Christian shrine, and then kind of had second thoughts and raised a pagan shrine right next to it. So he builds a church, and then next to the church he raises a shrine to Odin. Kind of like, I'm just going to hedge my bets here. Well, one of the things that was discovered in Sutton Hoo was a set of spoons. One of the spoons had inscribed Salos, and the other one had inscribed Paulos, Saul, Paul. That was typical in this kind of period to indicate conversion, baptism. Saul became Paul when? After his Damascus Road experience. Okay, so that's probably could be what that indicates. Sutton Hoo aside, back to the poem. Everything we've had so far, the first 52 lines, that's all prologue. That's before word. It's not really, really important for the rest of the poem, according to most scholars. So, Shield-Shoving is dead. He's buried at sea, etc. His son reigns for a while. And what happens? He dies. And after him arose the great Halfdane. Halfdane is historical. He was real. Okay? Who held the glorious Shieldings all his life, and Halfdane had 4 children. And if I haven't put it up, I will, because I've got a chart of the genealogies. So you have Shield, Beowulf, Halfdane. Halfdane has 4 children, and we get them named. Harogar, Hrothgar, Halaga the Good. Harogar, Hrothgar, Halgatil, as he's called. Til just means good. And, sorry ladies, unnamed daughter. Why? Because she's not important.
There's a...
She kind of is. Yeah, I know. There's a footnote.
Well,
So-
that chart's on page 131.
Okay. So who is the unnamed daughter, possibly? Yrsa. Or, if you are a Little Mermaid fan, Ursula, where the name Ursula comes from. Yrsa. This unnamed daughter, she's unnamed here, we know the name from other sources, marries a guy named, right, like a normal person, Onola, who will be mentioned later on in the poem, a king of the Swedes. Okay? It's kind of interesting because these are Danes, or Shieldings, okay? Later on, we're going to see the Geats, and the Geats also have this kind of thing, where you have genealogy, where you have Hrethel, R-H-R-E-T-H. I'm used to writing it this way with the Old English. Hrethel, and he has 4 children. Okay?
You want to phone a friend?
Who's the first one?
Haribald.
Haribald, yeah. I was thinking of the Old Norse. Haribald, H-A-E-T-H-C-Y-N. Use modern English spelling. Healak, and unnamed daughter, who marries a guy named Edgetheow, and they have Big B. Beowulf, okay? So, 3 sons and a daughter, 3 sons and a daughter. Notice H, 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 H. Doesn't matter. H, 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 H. B. Not an H. Germanic fashion, sons are named so that their names alliterate with their father's names. Beowulf's name doesn't alliterate with pretty much anybody's in the poem, except for the guy that he's a swimming contest against that we'll talk about in a few moments. Okay? So notice, Hrothgar, he's one we're going to be talking about briefly in a moment, because we don't really say much about these two. He dies quickly, but he's after Hrothgar. He dies quickly, he dies kind of quickly after that. Then he lives for a while, but he dies relatively young. By the way, these two are one of the things that really connects the poem with Old Norse, which we'll talk about in a moment, because of this part of both their names. The second part of Haribald's name, and the first part of Halfkin's name. Because this corresponds to Old Norse Balder, and this corresponds to Old Norse Huther. They're the two who cause Ragnarok. Okay, in the Germanic mythology. Okay, so, and we heard that blah, blah, blah was Arnold's queen. So the poet goes on. Yes, question.
Where it says he held the shields, held the glorious shieldings all his life, what does that mean?
What's it, anybody? What does it mean? Bottom of page 85,
Line
57. The great Halfdane who held the glorious shieldings all his life ruled as king. Think of, Queen Elizabeth II. I mean, she became queen when she was like 26. And she's, I don't know, older and dirt. I mean, she's reigned all her life. Halfdane did the same, but being human, he croaks. Okay? Then success in war was given to Hrothgar. Whoa. What about Harogar? Oldest son, primogenitor. Like my oldest son, who is my second child, likes to say, I'm the heir. And my oldest child, my eldest daughter goes, yeah, airhead. We get the explanation later. Okay? Poet's trying to get to a point. He becomes king. Notice, success in war was given to Hrothgar. Why is that important? Skjold Skjeving, that was good, Kinning. He obviously had success in war. So that his beloved kinsmen eagerly served him until the young soldiers grew into a mighty troop of men. And it came to his mind he was going to build a big old hall. He ordered a hall building to have men make a great meat house, which the sons of men should forever remember, and there within he would share everything with young and old that God had given him. Okay?
What's the Hall of Halls?
He wants the Hall of Halls. And I never thought about this before, but I wonder if that could be another kind of slight, or if you can have off rhyme, slant rhyme, can you have an off illusion? A near illusion. Because there is a biblical account of somebody who had this idea, I'm going to build a big old, not a hall,
Tower.
a tower. Tower of Babel. And what happens after Nimrod builds the Tower of Babel? Quote unquote, evil is visited on him. What happens after Hrothgar builds the greatest hall the earth has ever heard of? Evil is visited, yeah. So, what's he want to do in this hall? He would share everything with young and old that God had given him. Notice, he wants to use the hall to distribute treasure. Remember talking about the hall with the wanderer and such? The hall is the locus, it's the center point of society. He wants to use that hall to give away everything God has given him. Notice, except for two things. What two things will Hrothgar not deal in?
Lives of men and common land.
Lives of men, slavery, and the common land. He's not going to give out the public parts, to, I could go all modern political, the biggest donors, so to speak. Okay? So then the poet says, and notice, by the way, there's a phrase that repeatedly shows up, as I've heard, as I've heard, as I've heard. Why does the poet say that? What's the poet implicating or suggesting?
It's just being told to him.
I'm not making this up. How many of you read horrible book, Scarlet Letter?
Oh.
What to begin with? What's the title of the first chapter? The Custom House. What's the purpose of the Custom House?
Telling you where you heard the story.
That's where Hawthorne says, I discovered this manuscript. Tolkien does the same thing with The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit, the Red Book of Westmarch. Bilbo leaves behind the book. Frodo finishes it. You go forward a few thousand years, and some old English wanderer finds it, etc. Okay? So, I've heard. I'm not making this up. So, it's widely proclaimed, and what happens? It's not just Hrothgar's men that are helping him build the hall. Who else? All those encircling nations, they want to be a part too. Why? Could be that they want some of that treasure. What else could it be? This is a means of kind of, I don't know, buying off Hrothgar, tribute, get on his good side. Okay. So the hall is named Heorot, and we're told, there what it means, heart. And Sutton, who's mentioned in your footnote. And Hrothgar remembers his boast. That is, he doesn't build the greatest hall and go, it's all mine, and the treasure's all mine, He does what? He starts to give out rings, treasure at table. The hall towered high and horn gabled. That just means that when you're looking at the front of the hall, it looks like this. Okay? These are beams that are carved, okay, like antlers. It's named heart, like stag. Doesn't mean this heart. And the poet tells us, line 82, it awaited hostile fires, the surges of war. It's almost like they just had the ribbon cutting ceremony. That morning, they're having their first big party. And what does the poet say? It's going to burn, baby. It's going to burn to the ground. It awaited hostile fires, the surges of war. The time was not yet at hand when the sword hate of who? In-laws. In-laws should arise after ruthless violence. And you got a footnote talking about that Heorot is supposedly fated to be destroyed in a battle between Hrothgar and his son-in-law, Ingeld, the he of the bard. Who is that Ingeld? That's the Ingeld that I, other day, wrote up here. Alcuin of York wrote a letter to a bishop, to an abbot in England, and said, Cum Christo, what does Ingeld have to do with Christ? Cum Hieneldis Christo. What does Ingeld have to do with Christ? What does this Ingeld, okay? So the footnote means what? There are other sources that tell us about this. Not necessarily this narrowly, but that Ingeld will go to war against his father-in-law. Now, what kind of war would that be called? Richard Dawson used to do a TV show, game show, called Family Feud. That's the important word. If we use the Norton anthology, and this is one of the main reasons I don't, they will say the idea of feud is on the periphery of the poem. Kind of like the critics used to say the monsters are on the periphery. No, it's not. The idea of feud is at the very heart of the poem. It's the very center of the poem. The question is, what do you do about the feud? Okay? What does the feud lead to? Because the word feud, it's related to the word for fate, as in fated to die. Okay? And what's the very next line? A bold demon who waited in darkness wretchedly suffered all the while. So we get the suggestion of civil war, civil within the body, war, family war, and the poet immediately brings up Grendel. Why?
Is that the symbol that we're talking about?
Keep going.
Directly related to the feud. Because he's talking about the feud, so we got to talk about Grendel.
Why?
Because, come on now.
No, Ben, you're right.
No,
Why
it's
is
like-
Grendel related to the feud?
Because he wants, that's the symbol for the feud. Grendel is.
Well, because Grendel's also
Close.
Grendel is the feud between Cain and Abel.
Grendel is descended from Cain, who killed his brother.
It was estranged by God.
Family feud. So, we're going to have a son-in-law, apparently, if we take the footnote interpretation. I'm going to offer another one later on. We're going to have a son-in-law attack a father-in-law, which is a form of, family feud. And the very next thing is we have a bold bold demon who is the descendant of Cain, the first kinslayer. Okay? Kinslaying, by the way, that's the number one wrong thing to do in Germanic society. Remember the fourfold ethic? Duty to your lord, duty to your kin, duty to avenge your lord or kin, and then reliance, trust, whatever, in weird. Well, if you kill your kin, how can you then do your duty to avenge? You kill yourself? Doesn't make sense. I had Revel up here, Haribald, Hathkin. Hathkin accidentally kills Haribald. What can Dad do? Kill his son? But then he kills his kin. Talk about your catch-22. You're damned if you do, damned if you don't. I mean, literally. You're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't. There is no out. I mean, Jean-Paul Sartre wrote, there is no exit from this conundrum in the Germanic system. Okay? So, we're told, what sets off Grendel? Is it the fact that he knows there's a possible future kinslaying, and his future kinslaying antennae are going ding, 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 and he's zeroing in? No. What sets him off?
Hearing the joyful sounds of the hall.
They're having a party.
Dude, he's the Grinch.
I mean, Grendel's not like me. Whereas, if a neighbor's having a really, really loud party, it's not, I don't call the cops because I want to be there. It's kill the noise. Maybe I am like Grendel in that sense. Actually, I don't have any neighbors who have parties, but I used to. So, what does he hear, though, specifically? The joyful din loud in the hall, with the harps sound, the clear song of the shope. What song? Look at the next few lines. What does the shope sing about? The ancient tale of the origin of men. What have we already read that kind of sounds like that? How Cadman's hymn. How the Almighty created the earth. A bright and shining path, plain, by seas embraced, set triumphantly the sun and moon to light their beams. It's almost like Cadman is sitting in there strumming the... Grendel hears it. Why does he get so angry? It reminds him of God. I think that's got to be one of the reasons it makes him angry. He doesn't want to remember God. Because, God made him into a monster, as it were. And if you want to read an entirely different take on the same tale, read John Gardner's Grendel, which probably some of you had inflicted on you in high school. Okay? If you read Beowulf, you might have read Gardner's Grendel as well. I say inflicted facetiously, obviously. Grendel. Gardner was a great Anglo-Saxon scholar. I mean, he was really, really, really well respected. He wrote articles, etc., etc. He writes Grendel, a different perspective on Beowulf from the perspective of Grendel. He writes it in the early 70s. Grendel becomes kind of like Aragorn in Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings, an existential hero. He's kind of wondering, why am I here? And it's to terrorize, So, thus this lordly people, line 99, lived in joy blessedly until one began to work his foul crimes. Does that mean they lived perfectly? Hera was like Eden, there was no fall, there was no sin, until it came in from the outside? I mean, it kind of implies, blessedly, that word does, kind of implies that. I'm not saying that's the case. I'm just saying, words have meanings. And what did he do? A fiend from hell. Now, fiend, demon, spirit, he will be called. All of these imply what? Grendel is?
Bad.
Louder, Emma? Not human. That he's a, spirit being of sorts. Not true. Why? He's a descendant of Cain. Why else? He eats people. Spirits don't eat people. You need proof? Watch the one Pirates of the Caribbean. When Jeffrey Rush's captain character drinks a bunch of wine, the moonlight shows on him and you just see the wine flowing through his innards. Okay? That doesn't happen with Grendel. In fact, the first night he comes, how many people does he eat?
30?
About half again as many as are in it right now. Take that back. Almost twice as many as are in it right now. He eats 30 men the first night. Hungry little bugger, isn't he? The grim spirit was called Grendel, mighty stalker of the marches. What does that mean? He was a march stopper. We saw this before with the Wanderer, with this at the beginning, earth stepper. Now he's a march stepper, which your translator calls the marches. Yeah, that's literally what this is. Okay, but what are the marches? What do you mean the marches? Well, many translators make that marshes, which might be true, but where else is it? Those of you who are in my history of English language class, we're going to make this distinction in a couple of weeks. CH in Southern English, in Northern and Scottish English, anybody know what it becomes? If you go to church in London, what do you go to in Edinburgh? The kirk. Notice this is the same sound-wise, but ch becomes k. Okay? March becomes mark. What is that? Doesn't help much. It's the borderland. It's the in-between. In-between what? In between here and over there. It's this area. Because it's not like a modern national border where you have a line in the ground. Okay? Grendel inhabits the in-between. Okay? This miserable man lived for a time in the land of giants. What giants? I mean, more monsters. There aren't such things as giants. Everybody knows that. Just tell that to, what's his name in Princess Bride? Fezzi. Andre the Giant. Or, The Chinese basketball player who's what, 8 feet 5 inches tall or whatever he is. In the land of giants, after the Creator had condemned him among Cain's race. Who was condemned when Cain was condemned? Everybody who comes from Cain. Which, you know, you can go all forward. You can read a bunch of white American nationalists or white supremacist stuff. And who descended from Cain, according to white nationalists? Blacks. And pretty much browns and yellows and everybody who's not white. Okay? They all bear the mark of Cain. When he killed Abel, the eternal Lord did what? He avenged that death. Ah, good Anglo-Saxon God. He avenged. No joy in that. Faida is the Old English. Feud. What feud? The feud that Cain began with Abel? No, there's no feud with Abel. Why? Abel's dead. You got to have someone living to have a feud. When Cain killed Abel, who did he open up a feud with? Because a feud is like a ripping apart with God.
Good call.
Good call. No joy in that feud. The Maker forced him far from mankind for his foul crime. From thence arose all misbegotten things. Oh, and let's get the good names for these misbegotten things. All these misbegotten things are Eatanas and Ilva and Orkneas and Gigantus. Okay? Native Old English word for giants. It's related to the Norse Jotun for Jotunheim, the home of the giants, the frost giants. Okay? Ilva, Ilvred, Alfred, the elves. Orkneas, Tolkien's orcs. We don't have a modern translation for that. What is it? Nobody's exactly sure. Some people will say, they'll do this. The D-R-A-U-G-R, Draugr. Yeah, that helps a lot in English, right? What are the Draugr? Trolls. Some say zombies like things. The unliving dead. Or the undead living, whatever it is. And then we get the old French form. Gigantus. Okay? Giants. So, giants, elves, trolls, giants. Kind of have a thing about giants, right? I mean, and the giants who strove against God for a long while, he gave them their reward for that. Well, where are giants mentioned in the Old Testament? Because they are.
Oh,
They didn't what?
they've been before them.
The Nephilim.
Yes.
Who are the Nephilim? They're the descendants of the sons of God and daughters of men. Sons of God aren't, like son of God, we're all the children of God. Fallen angelic beings, so to speak. Okay? So, we get what's called fit 2. The manuscript is divided into fits. Think of them as chapters. Okay? There's a problem with the numbering of them, however, which we'll talk about later. Maybe, if we're not 10 weeks behind. Which after today, who knows? So, night comes, and what happens? He went to seek out the high house to see how the ringdanes had bedded down after their beer drinking. Who's the he? Grendel. So, Grendel wants to see how the Danes are doing after their Drunken revelry, it's a good way of putting it. After their bear Thea, okay? Notice when Grendel comes. 1, it's at night. And 2, it's after what?
Everyone's asleep.
Why are they asleep?
They're passed out drunk.
Passed out drunk. The poet's going to emphasize that when Grendel comes, or when things like Grendel come, it's usually after drinking. The poet's also going to emphasize, he's going to have Beowulf talk to a character, and Beowulf's going to say, man, you said an awful lot in your drunkenness. And then Beowulf, just before he dies, is going to say, never in my drunkenness did I kill my retainers at the table. Or never did I drunkenly kill my retainers at the table. There's 2 kind of different translations for that. Why is that significant? Well, this is an example of leave the monsters out and let's talk about social customs. How important is beer to Germans?
Yes.
I've got a brother-in-law who's a German. I've got a colleague who's German and go to Germany and they like their beer. Why? It's like water. It's better than water because the water's bad. And it probably was then too. And the beer probably wasn't that great. What's the poet saying? Well, we don't know that this is the case. Let me rephrase this. Tacitus, Roman writer, 1st century, in around 110 AD, writes a little book called Germania. That is, it's about the Germans. Okay? Why is he writing about the Germans? Well, he's actually writing about the Germans to shame the Romans. He's saying the Germans are better than we are, which is not saying much. Because what he tells us about the Germans is here's what they tend to do. They all get together in their hall, they have a few beers, dozen, and then they start to fight. And it's kind of a, survivor, last man standing, 30 go in, 1 come out. Kind of a. He gives us this description of drunken revelry where they start fighting. Well, we know from other sources, Old Norse sources, he's not making it up. Right? This is one of the reasons why in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, when Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, and Gandalf show up at Medusel, the Hall of Theoden the King, the Hall Warden says, leave your weapons out here. Why? Because in other Germanic literature, we see the same thing. Leave your weapons outside. In other words, if we're going to have a drunken ball, it's going to be fists only, guys. Okay? So, what does he find? A troop of nobles asleep after the feast. They knew no sorrow or human misery. Why? Because they are dead to the world. That's why. I mean, these guys are just passed out drunk. At least I think so. I could be wrong. And the unholy creature, grim and ravenous, does what?
Robes.
Now, what's the hall look like? Like this. When you're celebrating, you got a bunch of tables set up, okay? Hearth in the middle, and the hearth is just a pit, okay? Smoke rises up, and there's a hole cut in the ceiling, and it goes out, okay? And the king sits here on a big chair, and he's got other people sitting around him, not necessarily little people, but you get the idea. And then there's a bunch more tables and stuff. And so when it's time to go to bed at night, all these tables are trestle tables. That is, they take apart. You push the benches up against the wall, and generally you just lay down like this, okay, all over. But one of the things we know you do, is when you lay down, you take your sword and you put it right here. So that first thing you hear, it's like having your Glock under your pillow, so to speak, okay? You can immediately be ready. And Grendel comes, he takes 30 men. And Since he went rejoicing in his booty back to his homes to seek out his abode with his fill of slaughter. Not fill like he's carrying his armament, Thanksgiving. And we're told the next morning the people are made aware. Line 129. Unhappy sat the mighty lord, the long good nobleman. Who is this? The king. Who is this? It's Hrothgar. Okay? And what does he do? He suffered greatly, grieved for his thanes. Once they beheld that hostile one's tracks, the cursed spirit, that strife was too strong, loathsome, and long. Okay, strong, I can understand that. Loathsome, I can understand that. Long? How long was it? It's only been a couple hours since they died. No, that's the poet kind of telescoping into the future, if you want. Saying, oh, he's in for a long haul. This is going to be a long, dark night of the soul, so to speak. It was no long wait, but what happens? The next night. So what's implied on the part of Hrothgar's men between that morning and the next night?
They came back.
Yeah, not the dead ones. Other men went and slept in the hall. And the next night he committed a greater murder. He mourned not at all for his feuds and sins. He was too fixed in them. Then it was easy to find a Thane who sought his rest elsewhere. In other words, no, thank you for the invite, Hrothgar. I think I'll stay at the Motel 6. I don't really want to. Farther away, a bed in the outbuildings. When they pointed out, the Hall Thanes hate. He who escaped the fiend held himself afterwards farther away and safer. That is, if you lived to survive Grendel, you kind of moved farther and farther away. So he ruled, he who? Grendel. He ruled and strove against right, one against all. Okay? Strove against right means he strove against what was customarily right. Well, what is customarily right when you have a hall and a king? The king reigns. The king has power. When does Hrothgar have power? Sun up to sundown. Which means he doesn't really have power. So he ruled, he strove against right, one against all, until empty stood the best of houses. And that word empty, I'm pretty sure, yep, that same word we saw in the Wanderer. Edel, idle. It doesn't just mean empty. What's it really mean?
Not fulfilling its purpose.
Not fulfilling its purpose. What is the purpose of a hall? It is for there to be song and revelry and partying and drinking and jokes. And instead, this might as well be the hall in the Wanderer, which is deserted and broken down and empty. Because where is the singer? Where is the song of the Thane? Where is the Uisunt motif? And so it was for a great while, 12 long winters. The Lord of the Shielding suffered his grief every sort of woe. Time is accounted, or is counted, in the poem by passage of winters. What did the Wanderer say? One must do in order to have wisdom. Live his share of winters. Why not springs? Why not summer?
Those are nice. And easy.
Those are nice and easy. Why not fall? No. You got to survive what? Hardship. You have to endure. You have to bear it out. Okay? 12 years. And it's implied, it's not directly said, that every night for 12 years, what does Grendel do? He comes to the hall and he eats men. That is, some of Hrothgar's men go, I'm not going there, place cursed. But others, after a few of, not waters, beers, yeah, I'll fight him. I'll take on the dirty son of a... Don't know what he's a son of a... Cain. And they get it. He suffered his grief, every sort of woe, great sorrow. When to the sons of men it became known. Notice, when to the sons of men it became known, carried abroad in sad tales, that Grendel strove long with Hrothgar. What is one of the causes of Hrothgar's grief?
The death of his men.
That's one cause. What's another one? People know. Songs are being told, are being sung about the strife with Grendel. How much strife is there really? I mean, think of the word strife. What does that imply? Like contest. What does that imply? You're fighting against something. How hard is Hrothgar really fighting? Not. So, Grendel bore his hatred, sins and feuds, for many seasons, perpetual conflict. He wanted no peace with any man of the Danish army, nor ceased his deadly hatred, nor settled with money. That is, he wouldn't pay weregild. Duh. He's a monster. Nor did any of the counselors need to expect bright compensation from the killer's hands. That's weregild again. For the great ravager relentlessly stalked, a dark death shadow lurked and struck old and young alike, in perpetual night held the misty moors. Okay? Men do not know whither such whispering demons wander about. Now, what do you think that last line was for? I think that is maybe a teller of the poems mentality. That is, when this thing gets copied in, whether this is the first version of the Beowulf we have or just merely a copy, I think whoever originally told this poem kind of is imagining a setting where the poem is being sung and it's all been about what? A long time ago. Okay? In Yardabum, in days of yore. And then the speaker throws in present tense. Right now. It's winter. The storm is raging outside. You hear sounds. Men don't know where those whispering demons go. This is the person trying to scare the bejeebies out of 12-year-olds at the campfire. You know? Thus, the foe of mankind, fearsome and solitary, often committed his many crimes, cruel humiliations. He occupied Heorot. The word there, if I remember right, is really he ruled. 166.
Doesn't mean like he stopped coming at night. He just stayed there now, or
No, it means he comes every night. But it means he doesn't just occupy it. He controls it. Okay? And does what? We're told, do I have time for this? Because just about the next 15 lines usually can take me upwards of half an hour. Yeah, I can do this part at least. Shut up, don't tell me to check my names. Ooh, I don't know.
Are you breathing?
No pay Thona Yivstol Gretan Mosta Madun for Metoda Ne his Mina Wisa. Those are the lines. He saw no need to salute the throne. He scorned the treasures. He did not know their love. Okay? And you've got a gloss. And your gloss says, This is a much disputed passage. My reading follows a suggestion made by Fred Robinson in Why is Grendel's Not Greeting the Giefstol Arach Mitchell, and repeated in Mitchell and Robinson's Beowulf. Okay? The only problem is the reading is wrong. The translation is wrong. No, not he, that. I'm going to do it very literal. Gift, stool, the seat from which gifts are given out. Gift stool also, however, has the meaning altar. To greet was able. Treasures before the Lord, or to be very literal, measurer, nor his love knew. Turn it around in modern English syntax. He was not able to greet, approach that gift stool / throne, or altar if you want. I think throne's fine. Okay. Treasures before God, nor his love knew. Now, one of the reasons it's a problem is you'll get a lot of, critical commentary about who's the he. Is it Grendel? Well, Grendel was the last thing mentioned before that, so of course it's Grendel. Stupid question. Okay? Go ahead. Matham for Metoda. Matham. It's plural. Treasures. Well, what are the treasures? Because throne is singular. Can't refer back to that. Yes, you can. We often have in Old English an instance where in a positive we'll put a noun in plural when it's referring back to something singular. Yeah, I know. Your papers, you're going to get a GR, agreement error, written there. Okay? But it's poetry. It's not composition. There's flexibility there. Okay, it's 11:05. We're going to come back to this on Thursday. Where I'm even going to say Tolkien was entirely wrong. In fact, he's just boneheadedly wrong. So now we're only 1,400 lines, I think, behind.
You did say double. So yeah, sure.